There are certain people in American music whose stories seem to end the moment the spotlight moves on. The charts slow down, the tours get shorter, the interviews thin out, and then, without any announcement, the name simply stops appearing in places where it once appeared constantly. For most entertainers, that silence is the ending. For Crystal Gayle, it turned out to be something entirely different. What happened after the fame peaked, after the comparisons quieted, after the hair stopped sweeping across stadium stages and the Grammy wins stopped stacking up, is the part of this woman's life that almost nobody bothered to write about. And it is, without question, the most remarkable part of the entire story. To understand where Crystal Gayle is today, you have to go back further than the music. You have to go back to a hollow in the hills of eastern Kentucky where a little girl named Brenda Gayle Webb came into the world in January of 1951 as the last of 8 children born to a family that had almost nothing except each other. Butcher Hollow was not a place that offered its residents much in the way of comfort or security. The coal mines provided wages, but those wages came with a cost that most men paid slowly and with their lungs. The houses sat close to the earth. The winters pushed through walls that were never quite thick enough. And the children who grew up in places like Butcher Hollow learned early that the world outside was not particularly concerned with whether they made it or not. Brenda was the youngest. That position at the end of a long line of children in a struggling household carries its own particular emotional geography. By the time she arrived, the resources of the family, financial and emotional and physical, had already been stretched across 7 other lives. Her parents were not cruel people. They were exhausted people. And there is a difference, but to an 8-year-old who has just watched her father collapse from a stroke and never come back, that distinction does not mean very much. Melvin Ted Webb had gone into the mines because the mines were what kept the family alive. The coal dust that destroyed him was the same coal dust that had been buying food for his children for years. When he died, the weight of that loss did not arrive as pure grief alone. It arrived as poverty with a new and sharper edge. The family relocated north, as so many Appalachian families did in those decades, chasing the factory work that had replaced the mine work in the American economy. They landed in Wabash, Indiana, a flat industrial town that had nothing in common with the hills and hollows they had left behind except the same sense of hardship, wearing different clothes. Brenda adapted the way children adapt, slowly and incompletely, and with a certain internal damage that does not show up on the surface until much later. The Kentucky accent softened. The clothes stayed patched. And the quiet grief of losing a father at 8 years old settled somewhere deep and learned to keep itself hidden. What she had, and what nobody could take regardless of how low money was in the house or how difficult next week was going to be, was a voice. It had appeared early, the kind of natural instrument that makes rooms go still when it opens up. Music in the communities where the Webb family came from was not a luxury or a hobby. It was a form of survival, a way of carrying pain that could not be spoken directly and turning it into something that other people could receive. Brenda had been absorbing that understanding since before she could articulate it. By the time she was a teenager in Indiana, she already knew that the voice was not just a talent. It was the thing that was going to carry her somewhere else. But here is where the story gets complicated in a way that most people who know the name Crystal Gayle do not fully appreciate. Brenda Webb did not simply walk into a recording studio and become a star. She walked into a situation that was extraordinarily difficult to navigate because her older sister was already Loretta Lynn. 19 years separated the two of them, and by the time Brenda was finding her musical footing, Loretta had already become one of the most iconic figures in the entire history of country music. That is not a modest achievement standing in the background. That is a mountain, and Brenda had to find a way to either climb it or find a different mountain entirely. Loretta helped. That help was genuine and came from real love between sisters. It was Loretta and her husband who helped open the first professional doors, including a deal with Decca Records that gave the young singer her first real foothold in Nashville. But help from a legend is not the same as freedom from the legend's shadow. Every introduction came with context. Every early review reached for comparison. Every time Brenda Webb performed, audiences and industry people alike were measuring what they saw against something they had already decided was the standard. And the standard had a different name. The decision to become Crystal Gayle, both as a stage name and as a distinct artistic identity, was not just a business move. It was an act of self-preservation. And the decision, made in her teenage years, to never cut her hair again was an even more personal statement than it appeared from the outside. There was no publicist behind it. No image consultant suggested it as a branding strategy. A 16-year-old girl in a house full of noise and expectations and the weight of family history decided that her hair was the one thing she could control. The one corner of her existence that belonged entirely to herself and could grow in whatever direction she chose without anyone else's permission. That the hair eventually became one of the most recognizable visual signatures in American entertainment is one of those rare cases where a deeply private act and a massively public image happen to be the same thing. By the time she signed with United Artists in the early 1970s, Crystal Gayle had already spent enough years being told, directly and indirectly, that she sounded too much like someone else. The decade years had produced work that was competent and occasionally charming, and almost completely indistinguishable from the broader Nashville sound of the era. Radio programmers sometimes confused her records with Loretta's. That was not a coincidence. It was a consequence of being pushed into a lane that had been built for a different driver. Gayle knew it, and when the opportunity came to work with producer Alan Reynolds, something shifted. Reynolds was the kind of producer who listened before he decided. He heard the Crystal Gayle voice not as a country instrument that needed to be shaped into the standard Nashville mold, but as something naturally suited to a sound that crossed borders that the industry had spent decades treating as permanent. The voice was smooth where country typically ran rough. It carried emotion without the rawness that traditional country demanded. Reynolds did not try to make it rougher. He built material around what was actually there, and what was actually there was something that had never quite existed before in the same combination. Wrong Road again arrived in 1974 and gave the first real signal. It climbed. It connected with listeners who had never paid particular attention to Nashville. And for the first time in her career, conversations about Crystal Gayle did not automatically include Loretta Lynn's name within the first two sentences. That was not a small thing. That was the beginning of an identity that existed entirely on its own terms. Then came the song that changed everything, and it almost went to someone else entirely. Richard Lee wrote Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue and brought it to Alan Reynolds. The song was days away from being sent across the Atlantic to Welsh singer Shirley Bassey when Reynolds heard something in it that belonged in Nashville, or more specifically, belonged to one particular voice in Nashville. He played it for Crystal Gayle. The recording session at Jack's Track Studio in 1976 had the quality that everyone present seemed to recognize in real time, that sense of a song finding its permanent home in a specific performance. Hargus Pig Robbins opened the track with piano work of such clean simplicity that it sounded less composed than discovered. And the vocals settled into it the way water settles into the exact shape of whatever contains it. Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue crossed every line that was supposed to stay closed. It reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. It won the Grammy for Best Female Country Vocal Performance. It made Crystal Gayle into something no longer defined by what her last name meant or who her sister was. She had built her own permanent address inside the spotlight, and she had done it on the back of a sound that Nashville had initially resisted and pop radio had not known how to categorize. The crossover was not an accident. It was the result of years of frustration turned into intention. The image that accompanied the music was by then fully formed. The hair, which had been growing since that private decision in a teenager's bedroom in Wabash, had reached a length that had no real precedent on any major stage. It swept across performance surfaces. It required its own kind of careful management backstage, where it caught on costume hooks and door handles and required being pinned up simply to allow movement through narrow spaces. The care routine was extensive and time-consuming. The length created physical consequences that audiences watching from the front rows could not see. Regular headaches, persistent neck strain, the daily effort of managing 61 inches of hair on a frame that stood 5 feet 2. Combining it on difficult days left the body tired before the performance had even started. There were moments when cutting it must have felt like mercy. But the private meaning of the length had become inseparable from the public identity, and those two things reinforced each other in a way that made the scissors feel like they would take more than hair. The symbol outlasted the discomfort year after year, through the entire arc of the career's peak. Through all of it, the person standing in the background doing work that never appeared in the award speeches or the magazine profiles was Bill Gatsamos, whom Brenda Webb had met in high school in Wabash long before Crystal Gayle existed as a name or a concept. He had known her when the future was entirely uncertain, when the records were struggling, when the comparisons to Loretta were a constant source of professional pain, when the crossover had not happened yet and might not happen at all. Their marriage in 1971 was built on a foundation that had nothing to do with fame, because fame had not arrived yet. And when fame did arrive, the foundation did not change. It held. Gatsimo's moved into the role of manager as the career grew, and in that capacity, he handled the machinery that allows a performer to focus on performance, the contracts, the negotiations, the bookings, the scheduling, the entire infrastructure of a professional music career that grinds people down when is not managed with care and intelligence. The music industry has ended more marriages than most other professions through the specific combination of long absences, ego pressure, financial complexity, and the way that fame quietly shifts the center of gravity in relationships that were not built to handle it. The Gayle and Gatsimo's marriage did not end. It survived 5 decades and is still intact, which in the context of that industry is extraordinary. The relationship between Crystal Gayle and Loretta Lynn is one that the public has always wanted to simplify into rivalry, because rivalry is a more entertaining story than the complicated truth. The truth is that sisters who grow up in poverty together, who are separated by 19 years and an entire generation of fame, who both find themselves standing in the same industry at the same time, do not have a simple relationship. Gayle admired her sister genuinely and completely. Loretta had come from even less and built even more, and the sheer fact of what Loretta had accomplished starting from nothing was a constant source of real wonder to the younger woman who had watched it happen. That admiration never disappeared. But there was also the weight of the comparison, steady and persistent and sometimes bruising, that came with sharing a last name and an industry. Once the crossover sound had taken hold and Crystal Gayle had built an identity that was cosmopolitan and polished and internationally recognized, the contrast between the two sisters became something the industry and the public actively maintained. Loretta was raw country truth. Crystal was something softer, more radio-friendly, more at home in a Vegas showroom than a rural dance hall. Neither characterization was complete. Both carried enough accuracy to stick. And the friction between them, never hostile but never entirely comfortable, lived underneath the surface of an otherwise genuine family love. What time does to those tensions, when it does anything at all, is soften them. As Loretta Lynn's health declined in her later years, the professional comparisons stopped feeling relevant. Crystal stepped closer in a way that people step closer to aging family members, with the understanding that whatever old friction existed was small compared to what was actually present in the room. When Loretta died in October of 2022, the loss settled into Crystal Gayle's life with the specific weight of grief that has no clean edges, the grief of losing someone who is simultaneously a sister, a legend, a complication, and an irreplaceable fact of existence. And now, in the years that have followed all of that, the question of how Crystal Gayle actually lives is one that almost nobody has asked directly. The performing has not stopped. It has changed shape. The schedule is selective in a way. It was never selective during the touring years, when the pace was relentless, and the cost of that pace accumulated in ways that were not always visible until much later. The shows chosen now are chosen for meaning rather than volume. The Grand Ole Opry appearances. The concerts that allow the music to happen without the grinding machinery of a full touring operation. There is a quality to selective performance that sustained touring cannot replicate, a presence in the room that comes from the performer having chosen specifically to be there. In Nashville, where the Gatsimo's family has been rooted for decades, the daily life is quiet in a way that would probably surprise people who remember the image from a height of the fame years. The house is private, as it has always been. Bill Gatsimo's is still managing and still present, which after more than 50 years of marriage and professional partnership is a statement that requires no additional interpretation. The life they built together when neither of them knew how anything was going to turn out is the same life they are still living, adjusted for time and circumstance, but fundamentally unchanged in the ways that matter. The children who grew up in that household did not disappear into comfortable anonymity, either. Daughter Catherine became a singer-songwriter, following the musical thread that runs through the family with the kind of independence that only grows up in households where music is taken seriously without being treated as a performance. Son Christos went in a different but related direction, building a career as a record producer and engineer. In 2019, he produced an album with his mother called You Don't Know Me, Classic Country, and that project included contributions from Peggy Sue and